Again, good morning, everyone. Good evening for those of you who are in other time zones than San Francisco. So we are starting our journalism workshop. Today we'll be discussing an exciting topic of poetry in journalism. And this workshop is being recorded. I'll be able to share with everyone the link to the recording after the workshop. And I will also share with all of you the keynote, the slideshow that you will see during the workshop. I will briefly introduce our panelists, instructors on the panel, and I will introduce them once again when I start sharing my screen with you guys. So yes, we just had one more of our panelists, instructors joining us in the in our Zoom space. So let me go and share my screen, and then I'll introduce everyone on the panel, and we will continue to discuss this exciting topic that lies ahead for us today. Let me start sharing my screen, and you will tell me if the shared screen works well for everyone. Do you see my screen?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Lovely. All right, so our topic today, as I said, is to discuss how poetry and journalism are related. And we have a fantastic, inspiring, talented professors in journalism and social media classes that are here with us today. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce myself, Elena Eberhard. I'm a coordinator of Fashion Journalism and Social Media Center programs, and I'm teaching magazine, digital, and print publishing classes and foundations of fashion journalism. I'm happy to introduce Alexey Timbul Bulokhov. Hello, Alexey. Joining us from Valencia, Spain. Alexey is teaching blogging, content creation and promotion, and social media content development. And Alexey is a poet himself while being a journalist, so I can't wait to hear from him about how these two professions, these two talents coexist and nurture one another. With us here today, Flora Tsapovsky, instructor of Flora, instructor of social media strategies, creative writing, and storytelling, joining us as well, just as myself, from San Francisco East Bay. Diane Dorrans Saeks. Hello, Diane.
Hi, Elena. Hi, everyone.
Diane is teaching fashion criticism, runway research, and reporting. And finally, Josh Walker, who just joined us. I don't know, Josh, if you're on audio.
I am. I'm going to keep my camera off because the internet's a bit temperamental. But
absolutely, but I'm so happy you were able to join.
Me too.
Absolutely. And then again, if your connection gets a little glitchy, then just return whenever you can. Well, we understand that you have some internet challenges today. It happens to everyone, just happened to me recently. So hopefully technology will cooperate with us today. So I wanted to return to Diane and share a few more details about her background. So Diane is best-selling author, editor, design lecturer, and fashion writer and editor. So while being a writer, as I know, Diane is being inspired by poetry in her daily life. So we will soon hear a few poems that Diane selected for us to start this workshop. And finally, I wanted to introduce Olia Kedik, who just joined us on the panel as well. Hi, Olia.
Hello, thank you for having me. Sorry, I had trouble connecting.
It happens. Yeah, we all depend on connection quality, so I'm happy that you were able to join. So Olia is teaching blogging, content creation, and promotion with us. She's blogger and influencer, social media strategist, and entrepreneur. And so before we dive into our exciting subject, I wanted to pass the mic to Diane, who selected a poem to share with us to start the workshop.
Thank you,
today.
Elena. So I chose this poem for several reasons. And one of them is that it's by Allen Ginsberg, an American writer, who I think of as contemporary. The poem was written actually when he was at Berkeley in 1956. And for me, this poem encapsulates a moment when he wrote it and his observation, but it also captures many other things that poetry can do. I think sometimes we think of poetry as abstract, or we think of it as romantic, we think of it as many different aspects, but this one to me gets to the heart of what poetry can be today. It's one of many favorites. I have many other favorite poets, all very different and all very international, but I'd like to read this one first of all. And this is an excerpt from it. And let me say, it is addressed to Walt Whitman, and the great American poet and visionary and a gay poet who's inspired many, many, many people and is a favorite of many people. So he's addressing this to Walt Whitman, first of all, but it's an unusual format. So it's called A Supermarket in California. What peaches and what penumbras, whole families shopping at night, aisles full of husbands, wives in the avocados, babies in the tomatoes, and you, Garcia Lorca, what were you doing down there by the tomatoes? And Garcia Lorca is also another beloved poet who was assassinated in Spain. He was seen as a sort of a violent interloper. And so he was assassinated in 1936. So let me read it again quickly. A supermarket in California. What peaches and what penumbras, whole families shopping at night, aisles full of husbands, wives in the avocados, babies in the tomatoes, and you, Garcia Lorca, what were you doing down there by the tomatoes? So here's the secret of this poem. I first discovered it because somewhere on a telegraph pole, there was a handwritten notice, and it said, to hear an Allen Ginsberg poem, call this telephone number. The number is 415-763-6968. And if you call that number, a male voice will say it immediately, a supermarket in California, and read the whole poem. Mm-hmm. So call that number, 763-6968, and you'll hear the whole poem. It addresses to Walt Whitman. The reason I love this as a journalist and that I find it inspiring is, first of all, it's brief, but encapsulates a whole universe of Spanish poetry. Walt Whitman, a dreamy poet that inspired people for the last century. And it also feels very contemporary, but the secret is it was written in 1956. So as a daily journalist, writing books, writing all kinds of journalism today, I find it gets me into the moment. Just even with this whole family shopping at night, I always have this image of the Safeway on Market Street in the Castro. And I can see these people wandering around in horrible, just by saying whole families shopping at night, you can kind of get the chaos. You can see the fluorescent lighting. You can see the hideous vegetables that Safeway puts out, unripe apples, unripe various things, and these people buying them, and the husband wandering off into the avocados. And so just with brevity, this is the lesson for journalism, and not all journalism should be short. But quick note, this poem encapsulates a universe, a vivid universe of people, a universe at night. It encapsulates the lighting, the sort of tawdriness of Safeway, and also the idea of a supermarket in California, what it's like shopping at night. And that can be done with journalism. So every so often, I read this poem and it pulls me up and back into reality. And I'll be reading some other poems later that have very different points and very, very different styles, and that also teach me something in the moment. I just have to read it, and I get a grip of myself, and it pulls me back into language and the meaning of language, the forms of language, and the absolute wonderful poem that Allen Ginsberg wrote as a student in 1956 still lives on. Be sure to call that number. It's a wonderful experience. I have no idea who put it up. I don't know how long it's been there, who did it, who pays for it even, who pays for this phone line or whatever. But anyway, that's it. And that's my opening gambit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diane. Thank you. Thank you. Well, share the number with everyone. And I think this is one of the many random acts of kindness that we often experience around the Bay Area in San Francisco. Makes me think about a moment when I found with my child on the street, we found a rose, which had a slight, like a small a written label on it, a random act of kindness. So I sort of, those words resonate with me as well.
Very
so
good point. Very good point, Elena. Exactly. I saw it totally randomly on a telegraph pole. Fortunately, pass it on. It's great.
Exactly.
Thanks.
So let's probably, as you know, as journalists, as writers, let's also initiate and create those moments of acts of kindness and share them, spread them around. This is one of the topics that we'll be discussing today. And Diane, we couldn't start this in a better way that you did, sharing the poem by Allen Ginsberg. Here's our agenda for today. Now that we met all our panelists, we will go over some main highlights describing what poetry is. We will dive into what is the definition of it, what are the main elements, what makes a written piece, a literary piece, a poetry, and mostly we will talk about what journalists can learn from poets to make their writing impactful and memorable. We'll discuss poetry as a quintessence of the current moment, because both poets and journalists are striving to capture the zeitgeist, to understand and explain the events, the movements that are happening in the society. So we will focus on this role of both poetry and journalism. We will then discuss poets as modern journalists and activists. We'll talk about poets who are also journalists, and we'll review work of some poets who are also activists. And then finally, we'll conclude with talking about poetry in popular culture, reviewing examples of celebrities writing poetry. We all know singer Lana Del Rey just released a long-awaited poetry album, and that's being largely discussed now in the media. We'll talk about inspirational quotes and a new format of modern poetry, the Insta poetry, that I'd love to hear from our panelists if it's even a poetry, right? Or what makes few lines on a screen feel and read as poetic. And I'd love to hear from you how you use it in your daily journalist and content creator life, or how you get inspired by poets when creating blog posts for those of you who are teaching and blogging actively. So we're moving forward. Let's talk about what poetry is. So to set some terms and to remind you about those simple elements that make a written piece look, feel, and be perceived as poetry. So a definition that I found is from Encyclopedia Britannica. It is written by a poet. It's might seem somewhat sophisticated, but then I'll decodicate it. I'll explain it in a few more simple words after I read it. So poetry is literature that evokes a concentrated imaginative awareness of an experience or a specific emotional response through language chosen and arranged for its meaning, sound, and rhythm. So from this definition, we understand that poetry is a linguistic medium, right? Language and content are involved. It's a visual medium as well, and it's a sound-based medium. So the way how the lines appear on the page, or the way the lines are organized, the way how breaks and spaces are introduced, plays a role in the poetry impact. And that's most importantly a sound-based medium, and we'll talk more about it when we'll discuss various rhetorical devices that poetry is using to create those very vivid descriptions that we just experienced listening to the poetry that Diane read for us. So what are main elements of poetry? And a quick comment to our panelists: whenever you'd like to chime in with a comment, please don't hesitate, bring up thoughts, ideas that you might have on the way, or otherwise we'll go through a few slides and then I'll pass the mic over to you with a few questions. So again, to go over main elements of poetry, here are a few notions which are important to understand. So first of all, poems are written in lines, right? And words stop and start wherever the poet wants them to. So this notion of lines is important, and we have to keep it in mind when appreciating poetry, when creating it, when writing it, and understanding that that's one of the main elements. Rhyme, the repetition of syllable sounds, right? Rhymes, although are perceived in common culture, and let's say general public often thinks that most of poems are being rhymed. Well, modern poetry very often is written in that free verse, where rhyming is not a necessary value anymore, although an appreciation for rhymed poetry comes for many of us from childhood, right? From very early experiences of learning poetry, reading it with parents, appreciating it, remembering it as well. So definitely a rhymed poetry is somewhat easy to remember at times. So let's keep in mind that that's one of the classic elements of poetry, but that modern poetry is not always using that that rhetorical device. And then finally, the rhythm, the arrangement of stressed and unstressed sounds into regular patterns. So rhythm is a necessary attribute of a poetic piece that in a way creates that memorable feeling of those words returning to our minds and somewhat kind of getting into a repetition of those words in our minds and helping us actually to remember it. So rhyme and rhythm are attributes that make a poetic writing, poetic piece, easy to remember, write, and to retain. And then a few sound effects, and I know that many of you, our instructors on panel, are using those sound effects in your journalistic writing. So we'll probably stop for a few comments just after we go over this three main sound effects that poetry is often using. So alliteration is a popular sound effect in poetry. Say alliteration is repetition of a constant sound or words starting with the same sound. For example, the terrible tiger tore the towel, or alliteration is alarmingly addictive, right? Those three words are starting with the same letter. As journalists, we know that quite often alliteration is used in headlines, right? Most often, probably. So another sound effect which is often used by poets in their work is repetition, reusing words or phrases in a poem. And I believe I came up with, the example is not correct of what I did put here in the slide. The she sells seashells by the seashore. Kids Mother Goose rhymes is an example of alliteration, not of a repetition. I apologize. Repetition, another example of repetition that comes to my mind is from the famous speech by Martin Luther King, I Had a Dream, where the words I had a dream are redundant and are repetitive throughout the entire speech. And so this repetition helps to create that rhetorical impact of the piece. Although this speech is obviously not an example of poetry, but it's an example of repetition that I wanted to share with you. And finally, a brilliant sound effect that I know Diane is often mentioning to her students, onomatopoeia, using sound words to create vivid descriptions of a scene, to immerse your reader in a scene that you witnessed and that you want to recreate with those sound words for your audience. So those sound words imitate the noise itself. So let's say boom or crash or sizzle, crunch or buzz. Those are words that mean this type of noise or sound, and at the same time they imitate the sound as well. We can move forward, or if Diane or Alexey, if you'd like to comment on this, on those particular sound effects and how you use them in your journalistic work in a kind of a smaller.
Yes, Elena, speaking of onomatopoeia, I do like it because it can be very subtle in journalism. It's not expected, but very often it can be a combination of repetition and onomatopoeia, such as so looking to the use in fashion. So it can be something like sibilant silk. Mm-hmm. That sibilant itself already sounds like sibilant. It's a sort of a shushing, hissing sort of, it sounds like silk moving. It also looks great on the page. Sibilant is a very attractive word. So it's something like sibilant silk or crunching, crackling lurex to me is a kind of a crunching phrase. So the reason repetition and onomatopoeia is very useful in fashion journalism is that usually fashion journalism is visual only in a report. And if you can introduce the sense of what it sounded like, or the sound as well, the sound of the silk or the sound of lyrics crunching, you're adding another sensory dimension to your writing. And then if you can get some also into that, some sense of fragrance as well, fragrant, I'm trying to think of a flower that starts with F, but anyway, so some repetition of sound, but also a word that sounds like it. So you can do repetition and onomatopoeia and alliteration all in 2 or 3 words, can add a huge amount to a report and add dimension as well to a fashion report. Fashion is sound, light, fragrance, the crush of bodies in a fashion show, the sound of the music blaring out behind the models swiftly sashaying down the runway could be another example.
Wonderful, very, very beautiful, and I can't agree.
I just wanted to quickly, wanted to quickly, when you had, we talked about repetition and using an example, because we had brought up Lana Del Rey earlier, I just immediately thought of, I got that summertime sadness. And, you know, that's an example. And I was thinking about it. I like repetition in my own writing, but I think maybe not reusing the words, but reusing certain constructs, like, you know, a sentence that would just have like 3 words, and then the next sentence also has 3 words to drive kind of a point home rhythmically. Because I think what repetition does, both in reporting and in the case of the summertime sadness, it's a little bit like it's a little bit like pointing the finger, you know, like, you get it, it's this, you know, it's a little bit like adding a visual stress to the point you're trying to make. It's not just any kind of sadness, it's a summertime sadness, okay? So I'm a fan of repetition.
Well, it's also a great way to kind of playfully exercise the language ability, I guess, and that's why alliteration is alarmingly addictive, because it is there is this kind of a playful way to challenge yourself to find those words that start with the same sound and still have a meaning around it, right? So there is something slightly childish, and at the same time, kind of you can come with really elegant expressions getting out of it. So I definitely do recommend diving more into those practices and then play with them around. You'll notice that you will even talk differently as you do so. I noticed as I was working on preparing this workshop for you guys, I in a way started to talk differently even in my family life, and like coming up with those poetic ideas and expressions. So it does bring more beauty in our lives, I would say, even on a daily level. I do encourage everyone to explore and enjoy those word plays as often as you feel like it. Let's move forward. So another main element of poetry, which we often use in fashion journalism. So I see that among our attendees, many students are actually fashion journalism students or recent alumni. So you will easily relate to this topic. So imagery or sensory languages is the way to use senses to create a picture, a word picture, or again to immerse your audience in the scene that you want to describe for them, right? The imagery can be visual, where you would appeal to sight. An example would be the horizon glowed a deep red orange, right? You picture, you visualize that red orange color immediately, and then it does put you in a certain mood. Imagery can be auditory, where you appeal to hearing. Example is a cat screeched and wailed in the alley. So the screeching sound is kind of resonates in your ears with a screeching feeling as well. Tactile imagery is appealing to touch. An example would be grandpa beard was scratchy on my cheek. So you feel that scratchy feeling. Imagery can be olfactory and appealing to your smell. An example, I smell fresh baked buttery bread, right? Or I smell fresh coffee. As for many of us, we're in the morning. I'm sorry, Alexey, you're probably in a different olfactory imagery. And then finally, it can be appealing to taste, gustatory imagery. An example is the creamy vanilla ice cream melted. You feel that sweetness in your mouth and that melting ice cream. So again, in fashion journalism, we do appeal to those type of sensory languages, right? I know that in Flora's class of feature writing and storytelling, this is definitely one of the topics that are being discussed.
Right? Definitely, we talk a lot about show, don't tell, right? So how do you embody different situations and emotions and effects without actually saying that this has happened, but rather how do you really show the reader by using these details and these type of elements that you mentioned?
Mm-hmm.
I also add that I think it's really powerful when you kind of take these senses but use them in a way that you shouldn't. So like, why can't you taste the light, for example?
Mm-hmm.
Or why can't you taste something that you're not meant to taste? You know, it's just so overwhelming or powerful that you can kind of, it's so loud that you can see it, you know. I think that's also quite cool to play with.
Very powerful. Yes, exactly. So it's a combination of that sensory language, but combining the elements that otherwise in real life we wouldn't think of combining, right? But the poet would then bring those elements together for an unexpected effect.
Exactly. Like say that the backdrop of a show was all floral. The florals might be so stunning to the eyes that you can almost taste them or hear them, you know.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's a really, really powerful example. Thank you, Josh. So let's move forward, and I believe we will definitely return to those ideas further on, as I will ask our panelists how their work as poets or poetic exercises nurture their journalistic writing. So a few more main elements of poetry that in journalism we are using as well. So I just wanted to emphasize that this is definitely an intersection of poetry and journalistic writing. So one of the attributes of poetry is the use of figurative language, including similes, metaphors, and personifications. Briefly, just to remind you what the terms are. I'm sure that many of you know it already, but just to put all of us on the same page. So similes are a figure of speech involving the comparison of one thing with another object or thing of a different kind, used to make a description emphatic or vivid. So brave as a lion or crazy like a fox, right? We do use it when we talk about people, places, situations. Metaphor is a figure of speech in which a word or a phrase is applied to an object or action to which it's not literally applicable. So this is in a way what Josh was talking about. So an example would be her long hair was flowing golden river, right? So definitely she was not having, river descending of her head, but that's what the feeling was of her long flowing golden hair that felt like a river to the viewer, to the poet. And personification, it's the attribution of a personal nature or characteristics to something non-human, or representation of abstract quality in human form. So the sun smiled at us would be an example of it, where we would humanize, we would personify an object or element of weather or feeling, or again, something non-human that we would, in language, personify and give some personal nature to those actions or elements. And then finally, another important element of poetry is a stanza. So stanza is a group of certain number of lines, usually 4 or more or less, forming a division in the poem. So some short poems, haiku, for example, are combined of just one stanza, right? Josh, I believe, will be able to talk more about about this, about his short poems that are, again, combined with just one stanza. And it's amazing how much you can say in such a short form.
Elena, I have a poem I selected that encapsulates most of these elements you've just been discussing. It has similes, it has metaphor, personification, and there's an effect of sun. So here's a piece of it. It's by William Butler Yeats, Y-E-A-T-S. That's Y-E-A-T-S. He was an Irish poet, very inspiring. And I actually find I have several of his books of poetry, and if I open them at any page, I can find some inspiration from it, no matter what I'm looking for. Sometimes I might be looking for a title of a feature. I might be looking for some information to enhance a caption of a story, or some information in a book I'm writing. So just a quick note, I have a lot of poetry books, and I have a range of poets that I like very much. And quite often, if I'm a little bit stuck, or if I'm bored sometimes, or I just want to take a break, or if I need some language inspiration and need to kind of break things up a bit and throw in a little surprise, I'll open a book of poetry. Dylan Thomas is a favorite of mine. Jared Manley Hopkins, who was a Jesuit in the 19th century. But let's just look at this very famous poem by William Butler Yeats, and it's called The Lake Isle, I-S-L-E, of Innisfree, and it's off the coast of Ireland. And it was an island where he had a house that he loved very much. So with this poem, he's illustrating going across the water to this place he loves, this peaceful place. And this is about a third of the entire poem. I've distilled the central part of it. And I shall have, this is the poem now I'm reading, and I shall have some peace there, or peace comes dropping slow, dropping from the veils of morning to where the cricket sings. There midnights all a glimmer, and noon a purple glow, and evening full of the linnet's wings. Linnets are English birds. So I'll read it again. I think sometimes you can hear it better the second time around. So it's called Lake Isle of Innisfree. Highly recommend that you look it up. It's a very beautiful poem. And you have a sense of going over water. And then you even have a sense, as he described it, of the place, this peaceful place he's going to, the longing he has as he's going there. He's thinking of it in memory, and he's also projecting himself into that place. So I'm reading this now. And I shall have some peace there, or peace comes dropping slow, dropping from the veils of morning to where the cricket sings. There midnights all a glimmer, and noon a purple glow, and evening full of the linnet's wings. So you have color, you have a sound, you have an image of birds flying around, heading to roost in trees. You know, the way birds, linnets, flutter around kind of madly, and then they land in the tree, and you don't see them until the next morning. And then I must say, this phrase, the veils of morning, I've seen this copied by so many poets, and this format and this use of language, vivid language and color and form, I see many contemporary poets just pretty much copy it. They change a few words and throw it out as their own. But Yeats is somebody everybody has copied, everybody since has copied. It's very inspiring. A lot of his poetry is very spiritual in a very broad metaphysical sense, alliterative sense, imagination. But this is a wonderful poem to keep close by and have in one of your books of poetry. There are books called The Veils of Morning. People just open up a book of Yeats and take a phrase and name their book after it, no matter what the book is about. And anyway, Yeats, Y-E-A-T-S, love him and love his poetry. Find it tremendously helpful in daily journalism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diane. So for everyone, for all our attendees, I will gather all the notes and I'll summarize them. The name of poets being mentioned, I'll share it with you, with all of you, along with the PDF of the slideshow, so you'll have it for future reference, because I'm so sure that we will just scratch the surface of that vast topic.
Elena, before I forget, also for your notes, I recommend that everybody sign up for an online group called poetryfoundation.org. It's a very well-funded group in Chicago, very long-time organization. And they offer poetry in a very broad sense. They offer information about poetry. Every poet is there. You can sign up. They have poem of the day, and you can have a poem every day delivered into your inbox. Sometimes it's something that has to do with what's going on right now. It can have to do with Father's Day or some, sort of commercial holiday, but quite often it's just a sort of random idea. Other times it might be something that ties in with 4th of July or something. It's not, it's not overly structured in that way, but I highly recommend it. Poetryfoundation.org.
Noted. Thank you so much, Diane. Yes, there are multiple groups, foundations out there. So having Diane's recommendation of that one resource is tremendously valuable. So we know what the main references are, because again, there is a multitude of resources out there. So I'm happy that we can point you out to one particular resource that's being proven with time and approved with Diane's expertise. Thank you. Thank you so much, Diane. let's move forward, and then we'll soon transition to more talking about how work of creating poetry coexists with work of journalists in a daily life. Just before we do so, I wanted to share another resource with you that describes most common rhetorical devices. So we just shared a few of those with you, but again, it's an excellent language exercise to review those forms, those rhetorical devices, and see how you can, there will be probably things that you'll see you naturally are using and more prone to use them in your writing. You'll recognize yourself, I believe, in many of those descriptions, but you will definitely find out a few new approaches that can sparkle new inspiration and creative vibes in your work. So again, all the links in the PDF are clickable, so there will be quite a lot of resources that we invite you to explore after the workshop. Finally, a quote that I found from probably not the most known poet, but I thought it resonates with our view on poetry as applicable to journalistic work. So what makes a good poem? Strong, accurate, interesting words, well placed, that make the reader feel the writer's emotion and intentions. Choosing right words for their meaning, their connotations, their sound, even the look of them, makes a poem memorable. Words become guides to the feelings that lie between the just right words, make the poem reverberate, and give the reader the joyful shivers. So see how actually that applies to journalistic writing as well. Strong, accurate, interesting words, well placed. That's definitely what we require from a quality journalistic writing, right? And that what makes a good poem, actually. So the let's say the criteria for appreciation are pretty much the same. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about it. And as we transition to more discussion with the panel, I wanted to remind everyone that poetry as a quintessence of that current moment of the intention to capture the zeitgeist is the same just as the journalists are striving to do in articles and reports. So another interesting quote that I found is, poems are about experiences. Journalism is about facts, yet both seek truth. I'd be happy to hear from all of you if that resonates with you, if you agree or disagree. Let's transform it into a debate. I'd love to hear everyone's opinion. So I also wanted to hear from more from Josh and Alexey, how they work as poets and how they write, and what they can advise to journalists to adopt from the creative practices that that you apply to your work. I might be, so I know that Josh and Alexey do write poems. I apologize if I don't know this for you, Diane, Flora, and Olia. Correct me if I'm wrong, or probably just share with us what are the what kind of poetry, what kind of influence poetry brings to your journalistic writing or blog content creation, and what are poets or poetic styles that inspire you. So again, my first question was addressed more to Josh and Alexey, who are both active poets, and I'd be grateful to hear what are your preferred artistic methods when creating a poem. I was hoping that Josh will be able to share with us his screen so we would be able to see some of his poems. It might not be possible, Josh, right? Considering
I can put the links in the chat for everyone, if that
right.
helps.
Yeah, so, but tell us also a story of your poetry project that you ran in the past, and where are you today with this, and same for you, Alexey. So
I mean, originally for me, I started writing poems quite a few years back, and I wanted somewhere just to document them, put them online. And so I chose Tumblr because I knew a bit about the platform. This was kind of going years back. and unexpectedly they went viral. And so on Tumblr, I have about 120,000 followers. And I started kind of using a traditional like Olympia typewriter to make them. And I had a lot of messages from people, people kind of coming and saying, "Oh, I've just had your poem tattooed on me," those kind of things, which was wild. And then people saying, "You saved my life." It was a ride for sure.
Gives me shivers.
Yeah, and then that kind of followed a demand for something in print. So I created a zine called Breathing Dust, which kind of sold out, and I kind of sent that around. And I haven't reprinted it. I just wanted it to be like a one-off thing. And that's kind of up to today. Then I translated them over to Instagram fairly recently, but Tumblr is kind of where they kicked off. Yeah, so in terms of the question about how I go about creating them, it's hard to answer. I mean, Alexey might be different, but for me, it's always felt very instinctive, and every poem feels very different. So sometimes I'll be at the shops or commuting to work, and I've had to it's just fallen into place, just like bang. So I have to write it on the back of a receipt or jot it down into my phone, and it's very easy. And then other poems, there's a thought that I want to get out of my head, but it's really tough. So I'll kind of obsess over it for like 2 weeks, a month, until it falls together as I want it to. So yeah, that's kind of how it works. I don't, for kind of context, my poems are very short, like a handful of words. So I like kind of making someone feel as much as they can in as little words as possible. I kind of want each poem to feel like a gut punch, I guess. But yeah, so that's kind of how I work. But other than that, music is a big drive, and so are the novels I choose to read whenever I'm writing them. So I guess kind of what you were saying about a journalist, it kind of captures the current zeitgeist of what's going on culturally or within fashion. For me, my poems are what's going on within my current zeitgeist. When I look back, I can pinpoint, I was standing in Sainsbury's when I wrote that, waiting to buy a loaf of bread. And but I know how I was feeling at that time. Does that make sense?
Josh, can you read one? Can you read one for us?
Yes, I can. Like I say, they're very short, so...
So read two.
As many as you want.
So the most recent ones were, in losing purchase, we found purpose. We tore the darkness apart. So that's one.
You want to read it again, as Diane did for hers?
In losing purchase, we found purpose. We tore the darkness apart.
Right.
And another one. Don't be afraid to gravitate towards ghosts. Meeting them makes them real.
I remember seeing that one on your Instagram. Do you want to read it again?
Don't be afraid to gravitate towards ghosts. Meeting them makes them real. I can do one more if you'd like.
Please.
With you, I want to taste tomorrow. I want the seasons to collide. With you, I want to taste tomorrow. I want the seasons to collide. They're very short.
Yeah, I even thought, now hearing you reading them, because I read many of your short poems on your Instagram and back in time on Tumblr, I just thought that hearing you reading them is actually gives them somewhat of a different meaning. You probably could transform some of them or probably record them in those kind of sound bites.
When you were talking about rhythm at the beginning, it's weird because this is going to sound so odd, but for me to have a poem that's finished, it needs to taste right when I say it.
Mm.
It needs to just taste nice. And so that's one thing, but also having them been so widespread, people kind of approach them. I've learned, which I didn't realize, which again is a really important skill as a journalist, is the audience. So I'm writing them about a person in my life, but someone else is approaching them and kind of viewing them as if I'm viewing them through their relationship with God or spirituality. or their parents.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so it's really interesting how the same words can mean something totally different depending on the audience that you're either. With poetry, I'm not speaking to an audience, I do it for me, but when you're a journalist, you're obviously targeting an audience, right?
Interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting dilemma where as a journalist, you would think more about the audience, while as poet, you think of yourself and your emotions, your feelings first. And then it just happens that it resonates with the audience when you put it out there.
Yeah. So for a lot of my poems would be cast as love poems. So they're about a person. But then someone has come to me and said, this poem just strengthened my relationship with God, which is really interesting because I'm not religious. But if it's helped them find that solace, then that's great.
I'd be happy to share them. Yeah, go on, Diane. Sure.
I was going to say, so it is universal. It's personal and it's universal. It's open to interpretation, but seems very specific, but very open to interpretation. And I think today many people have feelings, ideas, experiences, wishes, and dreams, and cannot express them. So they approach your poem, they find your poem. Your poem probably comes to them somewhat randomly, and this probably encapsulates exactly what they were hoping to express, or didn't know they thought, or didn't know how to express. And you capture it very briefly, neatly, with a perfection that most people couldn't possibly attain.
It must be something like that. And like I say, like when I had people approach me saying, I've had this tattooed, or
where on their body?
Down the spine or on the wrist, a few.
Oh, right. You have a picture of it.
I think I have a few in the archive.
Yeah, there's a great picture of it on a woman's back. Yeah.
That's right, yeah. And
terrific.
It's, when people said to me, you saved my life this week, I didn't write those poems to save people's lives, but I still can't wrap my head around it, being told that, you know, it's, and that's the power of poetry, though.
Exactly, and that's even if you think that it was all for this one moment, right?
Right.
It's all worth it.
Needed it
saving one person's life, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It's mad, but I still am very grateful for all the messages I got and all the follows or whatever, you know.
Well, so Josh, your poetry feels very contemporary, and at the same time, it's an ancient form of encapsulating a moment. And let me just read quickly. You know, the Japanese have haiku, and many monks over the centuries in Japan were very famous for a very brief poem, a haiku form, which can also be tremendously helpful to you as a journalist or as a writer to see how a feeling, a universe, an experience, a spiritual moment can be encapsulated. So here's one that's by a poet called Izumi Shikibu. And it's just 5 lines, and it says, I'm reading the poem now. Watching the moon at midnight, solitary mid-sky, I knew myself completely, no part left out. I'll just read it again. It's a haiku by a Japanese poet called Izumi, I-Z-U-M-I, Shikibu, S-H-I-K-I-B-U. And here's the poem. I'm reading it now. Watching the moon at midnight, solitary mid-sky, I know myself inside completely, no part left out. And in a way, yours are briefer and feel more contemporary, but yours are in a certain way a haiku as well. It's a very admired form.
Yeah, they're often compared to that.
Are they? Yeah.
But again, I honestly didn't set out to, I don't write to any rules. It just has to taste good. It just has to fit together well. And I normally know it feels right when it does. I'm not trying to fit it to a structure like a haiku.
Exactly.
That's
exactly
structure, I think, traditionally.
Josh, do you read poetry
I don't read that much, no. I do have poets that I like, but normally for me, I'm obsessed with fiction. Fiction really excites me. And music, yeah. And but again, sorry.
No, go on.
I think what I'm interested in. So for music, funnily enough, like my music of choice is metal music, and that plays a big part. And then when it's fiction, I really like gothic fiction and unsettling fiction. So it's interesting to see all these things come together as a love poem. It's kind of unexpected, but it seems to work somehow.
It definitely does. Yes. And so how do you feel those two activities in a way coexist? Do you do some of your poetic approaches or moments then translate to your journalistic writing, or vice versa, or those are kind of two parallel worlds, let's say?
I fell in love with writing before anything else. So whether you're writing fiction, poetry, journalism, you're harnessing the written word. But I mean, like I said earlier about every poem feeling like a gut punch, that's what you want a headline to feel like, or a closing sentence.
Right.
You want it to feel like that gut punch. That there's so much that and you'll never. I can't imagine being a master of writing. Are you ever a master of writing? I don't think you can be.
But I do love that parallel with headlines and closures. So that's where that definitely kind of that collision of your poetic work and journalistic work come together.
And I think as well,
very good point.
When you're interviewing people, that also helps, because all these poems are kind of getting to know how humans work, how they think, how they interact. And you obviously, when you're interviewing someone for an article, you want them to feel relaxed, you want them to be human. So it goes quite deep, but there's definitely a lot of crossover. And actually, I'm really interested to hear how Alexey feels about those things, because I can imagine that between poets, it's incredibly different.
It is. And just before we transition to hearing Alexey, I just wanted to compliment your choice of imagery that you combine in those collages of words and images. So they definitely create an artwork in themselves. And I believe probably when you launched your Tumblr blog, you were probably one of the early Insta poets. That's also why they went viral. So now the genre is established. But you probably were one of the early.
Maybe, and like I said, originally they were on an original typewriter, and people responded to that because I think you can actually see the words imprinted into the page. So that the visual side of these poems also counts for a lot.
Yeah, I apologize. I didn't open the Tumblr one, but the Instagram, but definitely your Tumblr one is the original, where many of them are typed on a typewriter or handwritten on a little piece of paper.
That's right, yeah.
So they come as objects as well as little art objects too.
Yeah.
And then also
a whole drawer just packed with them. I don't upload everyone I write. You know, they're just everywhere in little corners of books and everything. And the ones I want to share, I'll share. Yeah.
So interesting, fascinating. So yes, poetry is a written form, but also, and this is why it's so precious that we hear in this workshop poetry read aloud. It is important to read poetry aloud as everything, as rhetorical exercise, to appreciate it thoroughly, right?
Sorry, believe it or not, that's the first time I've ever read one out loud. So that was also new for me.
That's a world premiere then.
I was slightly nervous, but there you go.
Fascinating. Well, thank you so much, Josh, for doing this. Even I'm surprised no one ever asked you to read them. And I tell you, as you do, the sound of your voice, your charming accent is giving it an additional meaning.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Josh. Alexey, would you like to tell us your poetry journey?
Sure, I have. In some ways, it is an opposite or a very different approach and an example that I would like to share. One first is to answer the question of if poetry, how I interact with poetry in my kind of daily reading practice or writing practice. I am a fan of the Instagram poets. I think there's a lot of really incredible voices out there. I think there's some that have become very popular, like Rupi Kaur, Said Jones, Naira Wahid. You know, there is a lot of these extremely popular poets that I do think they sometimes I would read them and be like, oh yeah, that is how I feel, you know, because I think we live at a time where so much overstimulation happens. And so many emotional triggers every day, and you just go, I don't know what I feel anymore. And then I read one of them and I go, yes, that is, yes, thank you, like, you know, or like and save if it's particular, it's a feeling I had a lot, so I'm going to come back to it. The example that I want to share from my poetry is, it's actually one poem that I wrote in 2010. I will share the screen and kind of read it along. So the brief premise of the poem is I wrote in 2010, and around that time, there was a first big wave of discussions around what eventually would become Obamacare. And so United States, there was all this media conversations about, you know, the death panels and just everything. Yeah. So there was so much discussions about these healthcare reform and politicization of it. And so at the time I was already working in Europe. And so I had kind of a lot of my European colleagues and friends asking, after they knew that I spent a decade in the States. And so they were asking, like, what's going on there? Why they don't want healthcare? Paraphrasing the question. Yeah. So I would have to kind of talk to them about it. And then I also was being contacted from my American colleagues asking, you know, would you do an op-ed, or what do your European colleagues think about it? So I felt caught in this conversation and trying to, you know, I was just thinking a lot about it. And so what came out of it was not an op-ed. What came out of it was a poem. And that happened because somebody, an activist colleague of mine said that they were going to have a poetry night in DC, hosted by this organization, One Common Unity. And the topic was going to be healthcare. So it was going to be open mic in Washington, D.C. With various invited poets. And so they said, if you write something, I'll read it. And so I was like, oh, okay. And whatever I could not or couldn't figure out how to express as a journalist or as an op-ed writer on the subject, I found a way to express it through, in the poetic medium, through as a poem. So I will now try to, I will put the link to the poem in the chat, and then I will share my screen, and so you can read it as I read along, and that way I don't have to do it twice because it's a little bit lengthy. I also have never read it out loud myself, even though it was performed live. So we'll see. Do you see my screen? Let me know if.
Yes, we do.
Okay. All right, fantastic. Thank you. So it's called On Healthcare. Dearest American friends, some among you express concern and confusion about the state of healthcare and the reform's hypothetical impact on abstract constructs such as political power, economic progress, religious rights. There is nothing political in the efforts of a broken bone to regain its ability to give support. No economics in the way cancer spreads throughout your neighbor's body undetected. Nothing of any religion in a drop of your loved one's blood spilled at the scene of an accident or a crime. Your own health and wellness of your community are ancient, inseparable matters, a balanced state of being that predates myopic ideas of this so-called democracy by forever. Do not be swayed by the rhetoric of capitalism, for it triumphs on a premise logical to itself only. Turn to nature. Do waves forecast profits from the wind's desire to fill its sails with power to reach home? Do flowers commission feasibility studies of the sun so as to reimburse its warmth with their fragrance? Does your heart count its beats so its capacity for love can be measured in the next progress report. Turn to science. Does a ray of light map in advance its path so as to predetermine efficacy of illumination? Do atoms cross-reference their credit ratings prior to forming objects and phenomena so diverse? Is there a formula for a raindrop's success rate as it commits to water's endless cycles? Turn to the sacred. Do ancestors see their descendants as a target demographic and guidance as a marketable service? Do the faithful undertake the cost-benefit analysis of a miracle before turning to prayer for mercy and healing? What gods have ever asked their messengers, gatekeepers, or saints, can you afford your fate? Turn to yourselves, each other, and those chosen to represent you best. Ask why should your body's health and wellness of your community continue to be valued only as commodities exchanging gamblers' hands? Do right, be well, sincerely, your many friends near and far.
Wonderful, beautiful.
So,
I really love it as an example of a journalistic point of view and poetry, just the perfect symbiosis.
thank you. So it took a little while to write because I wanted to touch on, you know, I was mentioning threes earlier. So I was like, okay, so it is political, economic, and spiritual. Yeah. So I had to come up with, you know, if we look at the politics, if we look at nature, if we look at science, et cetera, et cetera. So I had to think through the structure and then find metaphors to kind of express this idea or question the idea of wellness and how we relate to it and you know, so what I also want to share is that, so to me, it was kind of like all of my journalistic experience and actually journalistic requests, yeah, for op-eds or reporting, they found an outlet in this poem. Mm-hmm. What I also want to share in terms of how information and you know, kind of relationship between poetry and journalism. So in 2010, this poem went on a journey all its own. Like it just, you know, this is before things could really go viral, but it went places that were very interesting for me. Like I said, it was read at this One Common Unity event in Washington, DC. And there was someone who heard it and liked it and asked if they could read it on their like local radio station broadcast. And so they did that. And then somebody heard that and was like, oh, can we put it in our church bulletin? So it went there. And then like little by little over the course of several months, it actually ended up on like being read out loud on over 20 radio stations, in like countless Lutheran church bulletins, you know, and some other kind of progressive denominations, and also it was actually printed as a page in Seattle Gay Times newspaper. So it like went all over the place in very unexpected ways, and then eventually it ended up being picked up by the editors of Fellowship magazine, which is a magazine by the organization called Fellowship of Reconciliation, which is the oldest nonviolent activism organization in the United States for sure, founded in 1915. And actually Martin Luther King Jr. was one of the two organizations that he was a member of when he was alive. And he was actually on the editorial board of this magazine in his time. And so this magazine printed this newspaper, or this poem, mm-hmm. In its issue on activism. And so then I was like, you know, my goodness, I can just die now, you know, like I don't want to, but this is, it was really unexpected. It was really unexpected where this poem went and kind of, and then when this poem came out in that particular magazine, because of the kind of national attention that exists to that magazine or in the activist and political spheres, then there was like a second wave of this poem being read out loud, various places, etc. So we really don't know where and how our words can travel and who and how they can reach. And coming back to the quote, the brilliant quote you shared, that, you know, journalism is about facts and poetry is about emotion.
Experiences.
experiences, but together they seek the truth. Yeah. So one
yes.
of the very consistent feedbacks that I had received to this poem in 2010 was people saying this poem gave me space in between, like, the political chaos of these conversations and the medical drama illustrations that dominate the discourse on healthcare. Yeah. So it seemed that there was nowhere to stand in between, and this gave people some emotional ground to root themselves in and maneuver as this conversation developed. So to me, I guess this was a way to take a headlines type of situation, a recurrent news process, turn it into a poem, and then that enables people to engage back with the news, but in a kind of a healthier way. Yeah. So.
Do you mind if I ask? Did you write it all in one sitting?
No. The no is to I did not write it in one sitting. I think what happened in one sitting was each stanza. I would be like, okay, I think I feel that the part about art, the part about science is coming together. So I would sit down and get that done. So it was coming in bits and pieces, but because I knew the kind of topics it needed to cover to feel complete. So it was possibly a process of a couple weeks to get it together.
Yeah, that was my question. How long did it take to kind of measure it with journalistic work, right? So it kind of resonates with long form feature writing in a way.
Yeah, it was mosaicing it together. Yeah, I had the idea that it's an open letter to my American friends, that it's going to kind of, ridicule the type of conversation that exists, and then it's going to have these sections on these subjects, and then it was about filling it in.
Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much, Alexey, for sharing one poem story that became a story in itself. I'm so sure that you have more to share with us. I just wanted to pass the mic to Olia. Olia just disappeared. I know she had to go earlier. Hard to say if she'll be returning. I know, Flora, that you will have to leave earlier as well.
So I'd love to pitch in soon, yes.
Right. So if you'd like to probably comment for us if poetry is even inspiring your work, or how do you feel about the...
Sure. So it's quite a funny story, actually. So can you hear me, guys? Yeah, last time I had a mic problem. Yes, so I was born in Russia, and I grew up there until I was 8 years old. And as a Russian child, I was basically brought up in nursery rhymes by the best Russian authors. And they affected me so much that, in fact, my first foray into writing as a child was through poetry. My mom used to tell me the story that would wake her up in the middle of the night. Mom, I have a poem, write it down. And I had notebooks upon notebooks of poems I've written in Russian as a child. Of course, they're very funny and embarrassing to look at now, and they all rhyme kind of awkwardly, but this was my first kind of interest in writing, and it actually opened me up to my future career. Not that I knew that at the time. As a teen, I moved to really moody and really bad fiction. And as an adult, I returned to what I think poetry is partially symbolizing, which is kind of looking at existent reality and repackaging it and reassessing it and serving it to the reader in a different way than it would seem on the surface. So I don't write poetry currently, but as a writer, I'm very inspired by kind of the tricks of the trade of poetry. And the two things I wanted to say about the way I'm inspired by poetry as a writer. So after being born in Russia, I moved to Israel at the age of 8. And in Israel, there is a lot of interesting poetry going on, such as Yona Wallach and Nano Shabtai, very interesting poets, both current and already have passed. And one thing that is interesting to me, there's a group called Ars Poetica in Israel, which challenges the kind of widely spread notion in Israel, I don't know if it's that way in the States, that poetry is somewhat of an elitist medium, right? So poetry uses very fine language, like you said, all of these onomatopoeias and metaphors, and some people might be looking at it as a higher form of art, right? It has this kind of aroma, it has this sometimes image. It's also all about the reading and the events of poetry, which sometimes shut out certain groups in society. So Ars Poetica is a group that really challenges the status quo, and it's a group of Mizrahi poets. I don't know if you're aware, but in Israel, Ashkenazi Jews and Mizrahi Jews represent different parts of society that come with a whole set of different beliefs and kind of cultural stances and approaches. So Mizrahi poets writing in a language that a lot of people will describe as, you know, everyday, colloquial, common language, slang, and they incorporate it into their poetry and basically challenge the status quo around poetry, but also the status quo around who gets to write about what, who gets to cover what topics, who gets to, you know, reinterpret reality and speak of reality in ways that are inspirational. So one thing I think I glean from poetry is always challenging the status quo of reality, not only describing reality, but also helping my readers see maybe undercovered or previously untapped facets of reality. So that's one thing. And another thing is being experimental with words. I'm not going to say use all of the elements in my writing, because a lot of my writing is reporting. But when I write an essay or when I write something that has more of a free form to it, I challenge myself to experiment with words and maybe, you know, like you said, do combinations that are uncommon. I can bring an example again from Israeli poetry. Nano Shabtai is a 45-year-old female poet who's really famous in Israel, and she just recently had a book of fiction, her first book of fiction, and this is unlike anything I've read before, right? Her usage of words on the page, despite the fact it's fiction and it's completely different form, is so unusual and so kind of challenging and triggering and playful. So I try to do that whenever I write something that allows for experimentation. And this is my contribution to this discussion. Thank you so much. I will have to leave you guys after this. One more thing that I wanted to add, sorry, before I go, is that in the feature classes I teach, we talk a lot about the universal truth, right? So if you write a feature and you put a lot of effort into it, what is the takeaway, the kind of grand feeling, the realization that the reader walks away with it? Because if you want your reader to read a feature of 1,000 words, you have to reward them with some kind of a takeaway, a universal truth that you put into your article, and hopefully it translates to the reader, right? So I feel like poems are really, really great about really conveying the universal truth in short, effective, and really strong ways. Right? One of my favorite poets is Wisława Szymborska from Poland, no longer with us, sadly. And her poems are so just true to life, and every poem you read just comes alive with realization, and just a really kind of emotional, clear takeaway that you can kind of take with you and walk with it throughout the day, right? It illuminates your day. So I feel like universal truth is another inspiration I take from poetry.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. Thank you, Flora. Thank you.
Elena, to that point, that was very interesting. Very, very interesting. There were two great points Flora made. One was the idea that poetry is only for intellectual people or whatever. Of course it's not. We know that. And I think that's not an idea so much today in America. Anybody can write poetry just as anybody can write music here. Music here is universal. It can be country music, it can be folkloric, it can be classical, it can be anything. So I think Americans are a bit more open to the idea that, you know, a cowboy can write a poem, you know, Charles Bukowski can write a poem.
It's about 10 years behind America when it comes to anything societal, any kind of developments in bettering processes and society.
Right, so you're going in that direction. And also, you know, it's a small, mighty country. So, and Israel is noted for so many things, music, the music of Israel, and the musicians and artists and everyone there. And And I thought your other point was, and I wanted to make a point about this also, you spoke about a Polish poet, Russian poetry, and so on. And I must say, I find it very helpful to also get out of America or get out of English and read very broadly on poets who write in other languages. And here's a list a very informal list I made of a mixture of poets that I really highly recommend from various periods that people look at. Seamus Heaney, Heaney. Seamus Heaney is an Irish poet who's tremendously admired. I think he won a Nobel Prize, actually. So Seamus Heaney, William Butler Yeats, who I just recommended as well, marvelous, very inspiring. A poet that I actually won. In high school, I used to win poetry writing contests. I don't write poetry anymore. I write books, and I write all forms of journalism. And a special form that I'm developing in my Instagram, long form journalism on Instagram. But a poet who inspired me tremendously when I was probably about 14 or 15, a romantic poet called Gerard, Geard, Manley, Manley, Hopkins. He was an English writer. He was actually a Jesuit priest. And he is the champion of alliteration and onomatopoeia. I had thought about reading a piece of his, but I think it's better if you read it aloud yourself, because some of it, the alliteration and onomatopoeia, is somewhat ambiguous. Gerard Manley Hopkins can be tremendously helpful if I'm looking for some use of language and use of emotion. Open at any page. He's interesting. There's Elizabeth Bishop, an English American poet who was a sort of protege and I think a lover of Robert Lowell, Lowell, who's a big favorite. She lived in Brazil, actually, in a town called Minas Gerais that I visited, and she's Elizabeth Bishop. If you mention the word Elizabeth Bishop in this town, they'll instantly invite you to dinner and give you presents and everything. They admired her tremendously. Another poet who also, his use of language is fantastically interesting. Earlier in the century, he was actually Greek and lived in Egypt. So his world is quite diverse and universal. His name is C.P., so that's capital C, capital P for Peter, Cavafy, C-A-V-A-F-Y, C-A-V for Victor, A-F for Fred, Y. And his most famous poem is called Ithaca, I-T-H-A-K-A. Look it up today. It's tremendously inspiring, and I find it philosophically, spiritually, alliterative, metaphorical. The whole thing is a metaphor, and it alludes to the Odyssey, which is a Greek poem of about 300, 500 BC, and every writer has looked at the Odyssey, which you should be aware of and should know. It sounds like it wouldn't really relate to the present, but it's about Achilles and his men and the voyage to Troy of ancient Egypt. But every writer has, I promise you, has looked to the Odyssey for ideas. And you'll read a phrase and you'll say, oh, wait, that was the name of that Ingmar Bergman film. Film producers copy slices of his language. Hemingway looked at it, took phrases from the Odyssey. James Joyce took phrases from the Odyssey. So have a look at it. So near Ithaca, this poem, E-T-H-A-K-A, by C.P. Cavafy, it happened to be, speaking of contemporary fans, Jackie Kennedy's favorite poem, and it was read at her funeral. And it really is it's a very optimistic poem about life, about your life's journey, and your hope as you travel forward in your journey. I found it very helpful if I might be in a bit of a funk, like during this ridiculous pandemic where we're locked in and you're feeling like a prisoner. Open this wonderful poem, C.P. Cavafy. And let me read also a marvelous poem, a witty poem. I like poems that have wit and humor. This is by a South American poet called Antonio Machado, Machado, and it's quite brief, but pay attention because it also has journalistic insight, and it also is a form that can inspire you as you're writing a feature, for example, as you're writing a report. So I'm going to read it now. I love the brevity of this, and also the wit, and then also the poetry, especially at the end. So Anthony Machado, it's called Last Night. I'm reading this now. Last night, as I lay sleeping, I dreamt, marvelous error, that I had a beehive here inside my heart, and the golden bees were making white combs of honey, sweet from my old failures. Let me read it again. Last Night by Antonio Machado. I'm reading this now. Last night, as I lay sleeping, I dreamt, marvelous error, that I had a beehive here inside my heart, and the golden bees were making white honeycombs and sweet honey from my old failures. That inspired me once when I was writing. Well, I love the idea of this. He's a human, and it's admitting we've all got old failures in our life. And it's wonderful to see, oh, wow, there can be bees inside your heart that are making something sweet from your old failures. Oh, he's like me. He's got failures too. Oh, I've got failures. I can see this as something good can come from a failure. I shouldn't regret a failure. It was here inside his heart. Bees were making honeycombs and honey from my old failures. I love this thing. It's one that I keep some poems written on snaps of paper and stick them above my desk. And sometimes I'll glance up at it, and that can just get you over a little moment of doubt or a little moment of feeling, like a failure because you can't come up with the right phrase or the right word. I also was once writing a book about interiors of Santa Barbara, and I used poetry a lot in writing this book. It was a design book, and I wanted the writing to be quite poetic. So I would look at Yeats or Machado and other poems, some of the Middle Eastern mystics like Rumi and Hafiz can be very inspiring. And I use some of the language of this idea of honeycombs and sweet honey and so on in writing about captions about Santa Barbara. But brevity is another great inspiration from poet like Josh's poem, that you can encapsulate a universe and an experience in quite a brief poem, and then also link in a way that Josh does also this idea of being a human being, having failures, having old failures, but wow, you can have the stream of bees in your heart. And that, and then the idea of bees in your heart can be something that you can translate into journalism as well. That can set off a whole, for me, a trail of thinking about hearts and honey and bees and ideas that can feed into quite a factual report on something else entirely. And you can use language in a more interesting way as well. Thanks, Flora, for the idea about the universe of poems, because reading poems by many, many other writers universally and how they express universal ideas can be tremendously fascinating. And sometimes reading, say, a Dutch writer or a French poet, of course, all the French poems, Verlaine, Rimbaud, Baudelaire, and so on, you must be aware of them, and you must grab a book on French poetry, because that can be tremendously inspiring as well at any time of day.
Right, exactly. And then thank you so much, Diane. And then translating poetry is yet another topic where we'll all come to the discussion of what translation should keep from the original and how best to translate to convey that feeling that the author was putting into the words. So obviously it's great to be able to appreciate reading poetry, read aloud poetry in original language. You would definitely feel it closer to the way the author was trying to convey those feelings. But even at times, reading different translations of the same poem might be an interesting experience as well for those of you who enjoy that sort of wordplay and word exercises. And I loved in Diane's examples that idea of sublimizing a failure or something that otherwise would be believed as painful, but through poetry it alleviates the pain and then transforms it into
it makes something great from it as
exactly
well. Something sweet from
observative. Yes, and that sort of Zen feeling where you see this coming, passing, that too shall pass, and kind of coming in peace with the troubles of the past.
And feeling that you're just one of many people with failures, that we all have this poet had failures that he's writing about as well. You know, I must say, speaking of fashion journalism, I tried to see if there were any poems about fashion. I couldn't find any, but I think that maybe is because fashion is reported on daily and fashion shows have their own language, but poetry can definitely inform fashion language.
Oh, totally.
I didn't find a good example of it, I must say.
I had an example of a lot of examples of poetry being involved in fashion creation that we know. Valentino collection had poetry embroidered all over couture dresses. So there are a lot of collaborations, and then we'll get to talk about it when we switch to poetry in popular culture. But yes, again, the topic is vast, and I'm so sure that I do hope that we'll have more occasions to develop those two universe connection again in future workshops in upcoming semesters. So I wanted us to continue talking about poets, modern poets as journalists and activists. But before doing so, if Alexey and Josh, if you want to comment on what was just discussed, or otherwise we can move forward with the rest of the slideshow.
I have a quick remark when you had briefly brought up translation, translation of poetry and kind of the difficulties of it and reading different versions of the same poem, different translations of the same poem. So I actually had never connected these dots before for myself, but I have done that. I have read multiple versions of like Russian poets, for example, and you kind of go, oh, and you know, that didn't quite, and etc. And I've tried translating poems myself. And the immediate and direct connection to journalism is I actually, for a few years now, when I have to transcribe interviews, I think about them as poetry translation. Because I have this transcript of a person speaking for 45 minutes. I need it to be a paragraph, you know? So I have to literally like literary, translate what they said, because we cannot quite often put verbatim everything that they did. So I found that poetry translation is almost an exercise for doing interviews as well, because you have to distill what they were trying to say, keep some of the keywords or some of the speech patterns so it's recognizably theirs, but then maybe you kind of do away with things here and there. So that's, interviews are, transcribing interviews is
it's like translating poetry.
Yes.
Excellent example, Alexey. Wonderful. Thank you so much. As a polyglot myself, because I speak Russian, French, and Italian, I do enjoy reading poetry in all those other languages. And I have to say that learning languages, but poetry was playing a tremendous, gigantic part in my language progress. This is how you learn it in early days, because you just memorize it, and then those poems return to your mind, and then as you progress through learning, understanding the language, you then understand layers of meaning in those poems. So definitely, for those of you who are interested in learning languages and appreciate that part of cultural experience, definitely poetry is number one artistic format, artistic expression that I invite everyone to enjoy in multiple languages. But I love, Alexey, I love that that model of transcribing interviews that triggers the same patterns as translating poetry.
It's kind of like what was the author trying to say? You know, it's that.
Excellent. I love it. So Josh, would you like to comment, or we will continue with discussing a few more examples of poets, journalists, and activists?
Yeah, feel free to move on. I feel like you've hit some really fascinating points.
Thank you. Yes, and also because I don't want us to go too much over the planned noon time mark. We might go a few minutes over, but let's move on then. We'll continue to share my screen with you guys. So our next topic are poets, journalists and as activists. So an interesting thing that I noticed, that of course I don't have statistical research to share with you, but I did notice that while in some magazines, for example in New Yorker, there is a position of poetry editor. In some other magazines such as Believer, they also do have poetry column and a poetry editor, people who select poetry to appear in any given issue. So the interesting thing is that quite often, as I noticed in those two examples, poetry editors are poets themselves, which is not the case for other arts. Think of fashion, for example, where fashion editors are not designers, or theater critiques or movie critiques are not necessarily movie makers, or theater production directors, right? So it's an interesting thing that with poetry, because it's being such a niche topic, there is that multiple, wearing multiple hats for modern poets when they excel in their roles, when they get to a point where their work is recognized. At times they combine those different roles and positions. So again, an interesting parallel that poetry editors are quite often poets themselves, while it's not the case for other fields of art. So I did select for you two examples to, again, study on your own. The New Yorker has a fabulous, not only poetry column, but the entire poetry podcast, which is led by Kevin Young, the poetry editor of the New Yorker. Check out this resource, fascinating resource with live conversations between Kevin and his special guests. So definitely keep an eye on the poetry section in the New Yorker, and particularly the work of Kevin Young and his poetry podcast that he runs for the New Yorker magazine. Another example that Flora Tsapovsky suggested, so Flora left already the panel, but that was one of her input to the workshop content. That's quite a curious magazine called The Believer, again, a niche magazine, bi-monthly, about literature, arts, and culture, edited in University of Nevada, Las Vegas. So it does have a poetry section, a beautiful one, which is run by poet Jericho Brown. So check out his work and the magazine itself. As you'll be reading those poems, you'll see that pretty much all of them are documenting a cause or reacting to a political issue, society issues, pains of modern society as well. So that's definitely an excellent example of poetry as modern form of activism. And again, it's a curious, witty and fun magazine, intellectual, but definitely very enjoyable and thought-provoking for both journalists, poets, art and culture appreciating audience. So those are two examples I wanted to share with you. Then moving forward, a few more examples where poetry meets journalism. I won't open the stories for you, but I'll direct you to explore those cases on your own. So one of them is about the role of poets in documenting communities' lives. So it's a story about a docu-poetry project produced in 2018 by a poet and photographer as a series of interviews in a small community of Webster County in West Virginia. It was brilliantly described in Poets and Writers magazine. Do read this piece, and again, it is an interesting discovery. It was for me that there is that a type of poetry which is considered documentary poetry, as the same way as there are documentary films or photography, right? That's more of a reportage photography with less of an artistic aspect, but more of documenting people's lives and real life events. So this is one of the examples where a poet and photographer were meeting with residents of this Webster County in West Virginia and interviewing them about their lives, why they enjoy living in this place, how do they feel about being part of this community, and just kind of having general conversations about lives and their experiences, and then transforming them in series of photography and short poems. So an interesting case, I would say, where poetry meets journalism in that kind of special artistic form. Another exploration of connections between poetry and journalism comes in an essay by journalist Carrie Howard for Nieman Storyboard. Nieman Lab is a division in Howard University supporting nonfiction, narrative nonfiction writing. So again, a brilliant example written in 2017 where there are excerpts of poetry connected with events happening in society at that time, and kind of an exploration of reflection of those events in poetic experiences. And then finally, another stories that I wanted to share with you. Again, a little bit of homework for you guys who attend the workshop to read this on your own. It's an essay posted on Medium by not a well-known journalist, more of an aspiring journalist, but I did love his reasoning around the arguments why journalists should study poetry. He shares a lot of personal experiences, how he came to appreciate poetry and how it triggered the appreciation for writing more broadly, and how he believes made him a better journalist. So again, an interesting essay, although not from a very well-known personality. And then finally, I wanted to share with you a few profiles through few portraits of poets who are also activists. So one is Joy Harjo, or Harjo, probably Nia, you'll probably help me to pronounce her name correctly. So she was named in 2019 US Poet Laureate, and she was the first Indigenous woman to hold the title. So as she was receiving the award, she said about her new role that it's an honoring for Native people in this country where we've been so disappeared and disregarded. And yet we are the root cultures, over 500 something tribes. And I don't know how many at first contact, but it's quite an honor. I bear that honor on behalf of people and my ancestors. So do explore her work. Again, it's largely inspired by experiences and life of native tribes in the United States back in time, in the past and now. So Nia, I had you and your work in mind as I was including Joy into this workshop presentation.
Nice. Yeah. She's my favorite. So
she's your favorite? Yeah.
Yeah.
And Nia, how do you pronounce her name?
It's Joy Harjo.
Joy Harjo. So my first version was correct. I
must look it up.
I was hesitating around the yes, but I'm glad. So Nia, probably for your next magazine, who knows, maybe poetry can be one of the topics you could in Indigen.
Yeah, that sounds nice.
Wonderful. So check out the story about Joy and her work in publishedandvote.com. This link will lead you to the article. Another example of poet who is also activist, young writer Amanda Gorman, 20-year-old Harvard junior, who received an award of inaugural Youth Poet Laureate of the United States, again in 2019. And this this image and this excerpt comes from Vogue. It's one of the examples how such a popular fashion and lifestyle magazine covers topics related with poetry. So about Amanda and her work, one thing that I found particularly interesting, and that's why I did include her in that selection of poets as activists, is that she's also founder and executive director of One Pen, One Page, a nonprofit that provides free creative writing instruction for children in underserved communities. So the role that poets can play in changing people's lives, in helping the community around them, I think is it was made possible mostly because of internet and widespread of written word, spoken word across the society, and the kind of giving that universal access to everyone to those pieces. So check out her work and get inspired by her writing. And the third writer and poet that I wanted to highlight for you, her name is Lyrical Faith. She is less known than two previous poets, but I did discover her work thanks to one of my students in Foundations of Fashion Journalism class, Chala McKinney, my student who is a styling major, not a journalism major. Shared with the class Lyrical Faith Poetry Black Poem. So this link will lead you to the YouTube recording where Lyrical Faith reads this poem herself. And so Chala got inspired by the poem, and I did encourage her to reach out to the artist, interview her, and the interview together with the poem was published in Fashion School Daily, the blog of the School of Fashion. So to read the story, Josh knows this story as he was editing it for publishing on the blog. It came out just before the tragic events, end of May, beginning of June, and death of George Floyd, and then the multiple protests that had shaken the country afterwards. So again, that's an example of poets writing about the pain of their society, and then we do hope that it will help to make a change thanks to their work. So do check out her work as well. And then this link will lead you to her Instagram, where you will see various organizations that she's leading, and you can discover quite a lot of live events that are happening organized by these communities. One of them is Poetry for Service, a nonprofit striving to create social change in New York, and the other one is Black Greek Poets, and Lyrical Faith feels that she belongs herself to the Greek tradition of writing poetry. So again, a really interesting example where I feel the the content of this poetry strongly resonates with what's going on in our society. So we as journalists, when we write about those issues, poets can and should be one of the sources of inspiration, words, thoughts, as you, Josh, you said when you were thinking about more of a poetic work when you write a headline and a closure. So as we write op-eds of based on various issues in the society, maybe turning to poets will help to find those very strong, very powerful and sharp and accurate imagery in words that would help you to articulate the writing when covering pains of the society or when writing opinion pieces. So before we move forward, if you'd like to comment on this, Alexey and Josh, or probably you have other poets in mind that you'd like to share with us, or probably our workshop attendees, now that after you listen to everything that was shared, you have ideas of poets that you'd like to share with us that you think are activists as well.
I will just say the lyrical faith poem really is powerful. It's amazing. And I think as well with spoken poetry, there's that layer of performance as well, which I'm very much not used to, but I know that it's well worth the watch. It is amazing. But the only other thing that I was going to add was there's a company called Stack Magazines, and it's a subscription service, and they send you an independent magazine every month, but you don't know what you're getting. But it's worth checking out because a lot of the publications either feature poetry or are poetry magazines. I'll put a link in the chat actually.
Thank you.
But it's a great resource, and they have a Vimeo channel where they flick through all the magazines that they've had in the past. And it's really good if you are looking to discover upcoming poets or poets which are activists or who are activists. I check that out.
Thank you very much, Josh. I'm also thinking about Alexey's poem, which is an example of poetry as act of activism, right?
I mean, yes, in a sense it was, and it was initially performed at one of an event similar to the types of events that are organized by these collectives in DC. This poetry kind of as a tool for service or poetry for greater good also made me think about again it is a practice that I do that I hadn't connected the dots before. So I think sometimes a lot of current contemporary journalism is international journalism. So you get assigned stories or you get assigned cases, particularly in fashion. You know, there can be travel involved, and I can think of two cases where I went to countries that I've never been before. One is I went for a Forbes story to Nepal to report on Kathmandu Triennale of Contemporary Arts that happened right after the earthquakes that had devastated the country. And before going, I bought on Amazon a book of Nepalese poetry, because I thought it can be a good way to kind of course in translation, but to experience, get a mosaic feel for what the country has been thinking about or the feel for it. And then I did the same also for when the first time I went to report on Tbilisi Fashion Week in Georgia. I've never been in that country. I know it has tremendous culture. And so before going, I bought a book of Georgian poetry in translation. And I feel that that was an interesting entry point into kind of the mindset of the people or the mindset of the culture. And I felt grateful to myself afterwards for having done that, because being there, it created already a lens to be like, okay, I recognize that. And, okay, that resonates with that poem I've read. So yeah, it's another way to self-educate on a culture, a people, a subject, and these this list of poets that you've shared now are a great example of it can be an entry point into intercultural conversation.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you, Alexey. It's a really great tip and advice. Once we all will be able to travel again and appreciate cultures by visiting them, buy a book of poetry of this country or of this small place, right? And appreciate local poetry as well. And as you will be visiting those places, you will get a pleasant feeling of recognizing it or experiencing the feeling that you read in the poetry, and definitely it kind of adds a layer of appreciation to that cultural immersion.
Absolutely. This super quick comment on that, on like cultural immersion. I've read a lot of Lorca before, yeah, because it's kind of part of curriculum in school and university, and so I was familiar with the work. But it wasn't until I found myself in the south of Spain that I was like, oh my goodness, that's what he meant. It is oppressively hot. You cannot breathe here. Like, yes, you know, it may be love, but it also is like super hot. So until you experience something that you think is a metaphor, and then you find yourself in that place and culture, and you go, oh, okay, no,
that was not a metaphor.
I understand Lorca way much better now. Exactly, I understand Lorca way much better now.
Wonderful. Yes, yeah. So yes, I do wish to everyone to have this experience. I know Diane is an avid traveler and a travel writer as well. So definitely, yeah, you do have those examples.
Elena, just thinking, you're talking about local poetry, geography, and just thinking about San Francisco. And for those of our attendees who are in San Francisco, an essential stop is City Lights Bookshop on Columbus near Broadway. It's actually owned by a poet, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, in his 90s. And he was one of the early beat poets. And there's a whole enormous section of poetry there at City Lights. It's open day and night, and it's very well funded so that it's been able to stay open. You'll also find other kinds of books that you should have, and a lot of current and obscure poetry books, actually, and a great source for inspiration, and also one of the few bookshops now left in that North Beach sort of Chinatown neighborhood. But if I assume it's open right now, even if maybe only 5 people can go in at once, but do check before you go over there to make sure it's open. But City Lights Bookshop is a fantastic source for poetry books. There used to be dozens of bookshops in Berkeley. Sadly, many of them have closed, so I don't have any great recommendations. Maybe Moe's books, MOE'' books on Telegraph could be a very good source as well. And Green Apple Books out on Clement Street has whole huge poetry sections as well.
Thank you very much, Diane. I have a feeling, looking again at the list of our attendees, that everyone is kind of spread across the United States. So I would probably generalize your advice on identifying those local bookstores that are the keepers of that poetry traditions in those places. They will offer meetings with artists, with poets, with writers, and do support them. You know, go there, experience those places, immerse yourself into the literary vibe of those creative hubs.
Yeah, creative hubs is right. And Elena, just as a final point, I would say poetry is so personal, and what you like and what you're interested in and who you relate to as a poet is tremendously personal. And I think you have to read through all the poems and all the poetry to find ones who resonate with you, even if it's just for a year and you move on to Dylan Thomas, or you're crazy about Elizabeth Bishop. But then you could look up, a very good source would be to look up American poet laureates, of whom there have been a great selection, a jumble sometimes of people, sometimes some of them tremendous. Robert Haas, very influential, very admired, that I can think of. and also English. In the UK, there are poet laureates also, and that's very interesting to see who has turned up there. One very favorite one of all the Brits is Billy Collins, who writes in a, you know, in a very ordinary day-to-day sort of kitchen sink kind of way that many people relate to. And there's so many, you know, gay poets, spiritual poetry, activist poetry, but you have to find what resonates for you. I also see poetry as a working concept for me. It's part of my work. So I'm very open-minded about approaching all poets. For example, everybody should be reading Pablo Neruda, who was a political activist in Chile for many years, and then he was an immigrant to Italy and lived in Italy and often on an island, the Aeolian Islands. And he's inspired a lot of people. Other people like the romance of Pablo Neruda, and then other people can read Neruda and find the bold voice of political activism and the exercise of his point of view in his poetry as well. He's a huge favorite of everyone. He may have won a Nobel Prize, possibly. He's of that level.
Thank you very much, Diane. About Billy Collins, I wanted to add that now during the pandemic, Billy Collins with his wife, Suzanne, is running a lovely Facebook daily podcast on his Facebook page. Find him on Facebook, Billy Collins. And I believe daily, except for weekends, he is appearing in the evening, probably 7 p.m.ish or so. And for about half an hour, he shares examples of poetry, his and other authors, and it's lovely to see. When you said it's pretty much like an everyday near the sink sort of poetry, it is that kind of feeling as you see him sitting at his desk, and Suzanne behind the scenes somewhere out of camera is commenting or helping him finding things on his tables. Very endearing, very kind of I mean, you'll discover a great community of people appreciating his work. People are actively commenting on what he's doing. And again, we are during pandemic, we do have the sort of luxury to have a glimpse into personal lives of creatives, of artists we admire, we appreciate, and that's one of the cases, right? So do explore those opportunities, or probably run your own, where you will be sharing daily read aloud poetry with your followers on your social media or on your IGTV, and help your audiences to relate to what's going on in the society right now, and also for yourself to kind of sublimize the hard times we are going through. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Yeah, please go on, Diane. I mean, we're about to wrap up. I'll briefly go through the end of the slideshow, and it will stay as a homework for our dear workshop attendees. So I wanted to briefly go over poetry in popular culture and share with you a few interesting examples that I invite you to explore and appreciate on your own. So again, as I mentioned in the very beginning, the singer Lana Del Rey had just released, literally last week, I think, a very long-awaited poetry album. An interesting example for those of you who appreciate her songwriting talent and her musical arts. Do check out this new format for her, and it's captivating, and it does resonate a lot with journalistic writing. I really loved one of the poems from this book called LA, Who Am I to Love You? So the link here will lead you to the recording, and check out also beautiful review of Del Rey work by a young poetry editor, Eric Masons. Not only you will get to appreciate Del Rey work more in depth, but you'll also learn a lot about poetry from this young editor. And again, the singer announced that she will donate some proceeds from the album to the Navajo Water Project. Again, Nia, had you and your people in mind as I was including this detail in the presentation. So we do hope that the album will have success. It already does. Although on a smaller scale than Lana Del Rey singing work. So it's definitely proves that poetry does stay somewhat of a niche topic. But again, I do invite everyone to check out this new work from Lana Del Rey and also the review of the young poetry editor Eric Masons. That's also available on YouTube. And then another example of young London, raised in London-based spoken word poet, young poet, 24 years old, I guess. So he uses his digital platform to broaden our conceptions and our vision of masculinity. Check out on daysdigital.com his performance for World Poetry Day, which was recorded on March 26th. That's the World Poetry Day, where he's reciting 2 intimate poems. The poet name is Kai Isaiah Jamal, and you'll have the link to his work here. We already spoke a little bit about poetry and fashion journalism. So renowned fashion critiques such as Susie Menkes, Tim Blanks, Vanessa Friedman, and Alex Fury, the critiques who appreciate the intellectual side of fashion design and who often refer to historical dimension, to history of fashion when reviewing collections of contemporary designers. So they do quite often mention poetry or describe collections as poetic or point out the again poetic features in designers' work in their reports and collection reviews. So I didn't share a lot of links with you, but just wanted to point you out to those particular critiques that definitely appreciate poetry and its values in their work and do refer to this in their reviews. And then another very different example, young fashion journalist and critic Farron Krenzel, who is a reporter and a fashion critic. She also creates poetic mixed media art and posts and sells it on her website. So do check it leading from this link. And then finally, we will be wrapping up very soon. We already mentioned this particular genre of poetry, the Insta poetry, and it goes hand in hand with another Instagram format of the inspirational quotes. So I'm so sure that you saw numerous examples of this type of art in your feeds and probably already developed the appreciation or find out some of your favorite writers. So again, Josh is certainly one of the Insta poets, and I'm so proud, George, and honored that you're teaching with us in journalism program, and appreciate so much this new poetic dimension that you bring in your teaching experiences with the students. So I wanted to kind of turn your attention to those 2 genres, and as we are will be finishing the conversation, my last question to the panel was, now that we very briefly reviewed the place of poetry in contemporary culture, how do you feel as journalists? Do these poetry writing techniques help you to better write about contemporary creatives, to appreciate their work on a different level? Or probably if you just could comment on the place of poetry in popular culture, or give us examples that come to your mind when talking about this, these types of art.
I can start if you like. I would say Yes, 100%. I think when you're writing poetry and prose, you have more creative license than you would with journalistic writing. And I think that the understanding of that as a creative endeavor is going to help you understand other people's creative endeavors, which in turn is going to help translate them. And then the last point that I would add is how important it is to read as widely as you can. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, you almost get stuck in your own echo chamber. So even though, for example, I know which novels I really enjoy reading, I'm part of a book club where I'm reading things that I would never choose for myself. All these kind of things. I know that's not necessarily related to this question, but I think it's important to mention.
It is important, obviously, yes. I mean, I'd love to run a book club for the journalism program. So we'll see.
That'd be amazing.
If we'll manage to launch it virtually on Zoom while we are sheltering in place, or that will stay for the
Great
time.
idea, Elena.
And I think it helps your fashion coverage, because like when Diane was talking about the Odyssey earlier, if a designer sends a collection down the runway inspired by the Odyssey and you have no idea what it is, then you're half the reference is lost from the go. So I think that's another reason to explore widely.
Mm-hmm. And so being part of a book club, as you said, Josh, you're at times invited to read something that you wouldn't choose otherwise, but that's the beauty of it, right?
Because I love it. Yeah. For that very reason.
And then also it does resonate with journalistic work. Well, when we work on assignment, and it's not always something that we will choose to do.
Precisely.
Right? Not all. Mm-hmm. When we're assigned by our editors in chief, or when the topic of an issue is a certain theme, and we have to come up with suggestions on that very theme. So yeah, brilliant.
Exactly. It just goes back to that beginning point that if you know how to use the written word, then it really is just applying it in different contexts. So everything you pick up with poetry writing or fiction writing or anything is transferable to journalism.
Yes.
So true.
To me, I also see it almost like I'm wiggling my hands. It's almost like a physical thing, like playing with Legos or something. Poetry allows you to take a concept or an idea and just like pick it apart and pull it in different ways and twist it in ways that you would not normally think of. Like an earlier shared poem about failures and the metaphor of bees in the heart making honey of it. It's a way to almost physically turn that concept around, and look at it from a completely different angle. And I think poetry teaches your brain to do that, to spin words and concepts in 3D, 5D, whatever, any kind of D you want. Mm-hmm. And then you can bring that skill to your journalism. You can take a story and spin it, and you can look at it from different angles. You can take anything, any data that is given to you, any interview answer that is given to you, and you can pull it apart because you have that skill that comes from poetry.
That's a really good point too. Yeah.
Perfect point.
Yeah, and just as a final comment from me, there are aspects of journalism that sometimes can make a writer feel a bit boxed in, because you're dealing with research, you're dealing with an interview that obviously you must report that person accurately. You're looking at objectivity, you're looking at the basis of journalism: objectivity, balance, information, details, facts underlie all of journalism that must have those aspects. But then separately, there's writing. And one thing we haven't mentioned so much in the poetry is the sound of it, the look of it, the look of the words, the sound of it. And so sometimes I can be writing about architecture, or I'm writing about interior design, I'm writing about fashion, I'm writing about many different aspects of travel as well, travel design, aspects of traveling. And I find poetry, after I've done the research and got the facts and got my ideas together, quite often if I jump into a poem, I can get a looser feeling about the language that I could be using, moving a bit away, maintaining the framework of facts that's required for journalism, but expressing it in a more poetic way. So I propose that everybody start collecting books of poetry and finding out who they love and looking at the exploration, and think about a poet like Dylan Thomas, who spent years perfecting language and understanding language and using language. So let them do the work for you. You have the enjoyment and the pleasure and the inspiration of reading their work, and then finding inspiration in that for factual journalism as well. It's a never-ending work, and it's a lifelong work, and you're always discovering new poetry and new language, new ideas, new words. I do feel today, sadly, that speaking for myself, living in California in particular, and through the hideous influence of social media, I'm losing vocabulary every day, I think. And sometimes you'll encounter a word somewhere randomly, and I think, wow, I haven't heard that word for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
So poetry can take us back to vocabulary as well. Mm-hmm. Finding vocabulary can be tremendously important and inspiration. It can move you forward as well. Poetry will do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diane. So let's cherish the words, find them, collect them, respect them, enjoy them, and appreciate them. I'd like to thank everyone who participated in the workshop. Thank you, our brilliant panelists. Thank you, Diane. Thank you, Alexey, and thank you, Josh, so much for this inspiring conversation today. I believe the recording will go a long way, just as it did, Alexey, with your poem. I wanted to probably briefly open the floor to questions. I see that Nia is sharing a thought and observation here. One of my mother's colleagues and close friend, Ophelia Zepeda, is also an indigenous poet. She's Tohono O'odham from Tucson, Arizona. She's also a linguist and professor at the University of Arizona. Thank you, Nia. Thank you. I'll make sure to include her in the list of the resources I'll be sharing with everyone. So if those of you who remained with us until the end, if you guys have questions, please, now is the right moment to ask them. And again, all our panelists, instructors are available for private conversations. I'll share with all of you their social media handles. That might be a good way to keep in touch as well. And you have my contacts here and the link to the blog of the school and to our Instagram. So thank you so much, everyone, and happy writing. If you have any questions.
Thank you, Elena.
Thank you, Diane. Thanks. If you guys have any questions, now is the right time. Caitlin, Nia, Janelle, and Destiny, who are still here with us. Thank you everyone for staying until the end, and I'm sorry that we again ran out of time, but it's such a fascinating topic. We could go on and on and on, and I'm so sure that we'll find another new occasions to discuss those topics in future. Any questions from our attendees? Sarah is saying, thank you all, that was very interesting, I must go. Be safe and have a great evening. Janelle says thank you, and Nia is sharing the link. So I guess we will be finishing at this note. Thank you so much, everyone. I'll be.
Thank you, Elena. Thank you. Beautiful. Let's do another one.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah,
yes.
Let's do another one.
Thank you.
We will. Yeah, let's do it in the fall.
Great.
Absolutely.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Alexey. Good to meet you. Thanks, Josh. Great to meet you.
Good to meet you too.
Ciao, ciao, everybody.
Ciao.
Bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Have a nice rest of the day.